Acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. And as we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever in the Aboriginal custodianship of country. My name is Julie Sommerfeld and I'm Manager of Rare Books and Special Collections here at the University of Sydney Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the inaugural Selby Old Fellowship Lecture. On behalf of the University of Sydney and staff from Fisher Library, thank you to the trustees of the Selby Old Foundation for generously supporting the establishment of the Selby Old Fellowship. This generous grant enables the university to deliver an annual program focusing on the scholarly study of the religious history of the Christian faith. This is the first time the University Library has offered a fellowship, and it supports our strategy of enhancing the promotion of and the engagement with our rare books and special collections as a unique research and teaching resource. And now to our speakers today. After 9 years of assistant lectureship in the University of Bucharest's Faculty of Orthodox Theology, since 2005, Associate Professor Doru Costache works at the Sydney College of Divinity, where he teaches for two member institutions, Nisibis and St. Cyril's, and offers supervision by the Graduate Research School. He is the first recipient of the Selby Old Fellowship from 2021 to 2022, and since 2017, he is also an Honorary Associate of Studies in Religion, School of Humanities at the University of Sydney. Today, Doru is going to summarise his research on an early medieval Gospel Lectionary from the Eastern Orthodox Church, known as the Codex Angus, held in Rare Books and Special Collections here at the University Library. This text was purported to have been written in one of the scriptoria of Constantinople around the 12th century. Following Doru's lecture, we also have Dr Andrew Mellas delivering an academic response. This academic conversation will contextualise Doru's research and encourage reflection and questions on this fascinating manuscript. In 2018, Andrew Mellas completed a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney on the emotion of compunction in Byzantium. He's currently a senior lecturer at St Andrew's Theological College, Sydney College of Divinity, and an honorary associate at the University of Sydney Medieval and Early Modern Centre. Andrew has published various books, chapters and articles on the history of Byzantium, liturgics and hymnody, as well as presenting papers on these subjects at international conferences. In 2020, his first monograph, Liturgy and the Emotions in Byzantium, was published by Cambridge University Press. His current projects include exploring the liturgical intersections of hagiography and hymnography and editing the Cambridge Companion to the Byzantine Church. He's also a member of the Australian Byzantine Choir. Please join me in welcoming Doru Costache to present and then Andrew Mellas to respond.
Thank you very much, Julie, for this introduction. Beautiful. And I'm honored to see people whom I have also remarked in the audience during my Rare Bites talk. Now, Codex Angus. I'll be addressing the topic from the viewpoint of my own tradition. I'm Orthodox Christian, and also from the viewpoint of what we currently call Orthodox studies. During my tenure as the inaugural Selby Old Fellow in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith at the University of Sydney Library, I have been given the opportunity to study a little-known Byzantine manuscript, Codex Angus. A digital version of this manuscript the library's rare books and special collections section, manuscript 40, can be downloaded from the online catalog. And you see there the handle. This digital version was produced before the manuscript was restored with funds from the Selby Old Foundation in 2021. According to the library record, Codex Angus is a liturgical lectionary, thus containing gospel readings for the liturgical year, written in Constantinople in the 11th or the 12th century, consisting of 122 parchment leaves. Sometime in recent history, the pages have been numbered in pencil, though whoever did that was not particularly careful. As a fun fact, while the text continues uninterrupted, the pagination jumps from page 14 to page 16, something that the manuscript researchers so far have not noticed. But I will not be dwelling on such matters here. Well, apart from drawing attention to the library that the actual number of folios is 121, and that therefore the manuscript contains 242 pages, not 244. I might say from the outset that even though I have studied classical, Koine or Hellenistic Greek, and Byzantine Greek for 6 years in Romania and back in the day, I'm not trained in either paleography or codicology. My academic interest is in early Christian and Byzantine worldviews, experiences of holiness, and early Christianity understood as a philosophical school. And these are my most treasured publications, what you see on the slides. The 2021 monograph, Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations at Brill, and the co-authored volume, Dreams, Virtue, and Divine Knowledge in Early Christian Egypt, published at Cambridge University Press in 2019. Occasionally, I consider matters of faith and culture, especially in regard to the early Christian centuries, but with a view to understanding certain issues, my own Eastern or Byzantine Orthodox tradition experiences in the contemporary world. Hereafter, for convenience purposes, I shall refer to Orthodoxy without adding Eastern or Byzantine, but nothing I have to say here includes other forms of Orthodoxy, such as the Oriental one. And so the realm of manuscripts and paleography is to me terra incognita. Accordingly, throughout my tenure at the library, I have approached Codex Angus from the viewpoint of Orthodox studies, a burgeoning field across the Western world, but unpardonably undeveloped down under, if at all represented on these shores. What determined me to accept the challenge of working on the manuscript is a more recent interest of mine, pastoral in nature, namely the structure of the Orthodox Lectionary, which I treat as integral to the representation of Christianity as a philosophical school. And you can see there some of my recent outputs that has to do with this side of my research, various articles, book chapters. I take this opportunity, therefore, to congratulate the University of Sydney Library and the Selby Old Foundation for inaugurating an Australian framework for Orthodox Christian studies by establishing the fellowship, whose first and grateful beneficiary I have been honored to be until the beginning of this month. Given the lockdowns and other factors such as holidays, I was unable to access Codex Angus physically before May this year. Until that time, I worked on other projects in the area of Orthodox studies, which resulted in a couple of publications, pictured there, in international outlets, with a couple more forthcoming. In parallel, I kept working towards my second doctoral dissertation in studies in religion here at the university on zodiacal motifs in Orthodox iconography. Since May, however, I have dedicated most of my effort to exploring the manuscript under consideration. In what follows, I present my findings from the viewpoint of Orthodox studies. To that end, first I introduce aspects of the Byzantine liturgical tradition to which the Orthodox adhere to this day and which Codex Angus faithfully illustrates. It is within this context that I discuss the liturgical structure of the early yearly lectionary as typical for the experience of a philosophical community. Second, I turn to the manuscript's history by reviewing the available information and the hypothesis recently put forward by two scholars who studied it. Third, I present some of my findings at the end of half a year of exploration. And fourth, I focus upon the scriptural readings for the Paschal season from Easter to Pentecost, and the relevance of Codex Angus for the Orthodox Christian experience. Now, elements of the Byzantine liturgical tradition. To this day, the Eastern Orthodox churches follow the liturgical rhythms of the Byzantine tradition. These rhythms observe the astronomical year and therefore have a cyclical structure. Just picture this. Possibly since the second half of the 6th century, when the first attempts at organizing the annual lectionary were unequivocally recorded, year after year, Orthodox Christians embark on an annual journey through roughly the same selection of scriptural passages. This is the case of the Old Testament, with Genesis, Proverbs, and Isaiah being prescribed as Lenten readings, for example, while the narrative of the days of creation in Genesis is recited for both Christmas and Easter in the context of festal vespers. The same goes for the New Testament, where the same passages from John, Matthew, Luke, and Mark are visited on a yearly basis. Mind the order of these pericopes, though. For the purposes of securing the shared view of things through both corporate and personal reading, the Orthodox do not follow the order of the biblical collection, namely Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The difference is significant. While the New Testament displays the 4 canonical Gospels in a sequence that echoes the realities of the first and the second Christian centuries, that is, the message addressed to the Jews, Matthew, to the Gentiles, Mark, to interested notables and intellectuals, Luke, and to existing Christian communities, John, the Byzantines reorganized the canon to reflect their realities and to suit their purposes. This was the age of Christendom, the Christian era by all intents and purposes, when the Church experienced different realities and corresponding challenges. It seems to me that the most pressing concern for the Byzantines was to consolidate the established communities by highlighting what was considered foundational, essential in terms of the Christian perception of Jesus Christ, the Anointed One, and his message. And that foundational perception can be found in the 4th canonical Gospel, John. John does not attempt to convince anyone to believe in Jesus as God's anointed, Logos of creation, and true God, the primordial Lamb on whose self-sacrifice the universe and the renewed life are founded. No, established communities do not need convincing. Accordingly, John states all this simply as a reminder to believers of what they believe in and why they do so. No wonder the Byzantines prescribed the other canonical Gospels to be read during the liturgical year in the light of John's Gospel as an expression of mature faith. It goes the same for the other New Testament annual cycle of readings from the Apostolic Letters. This cycle is prefaced by selections of passages from Acts of the Apostles, which outlines the nature and the spirit of the Christian Church, from the vantage point of which believers are invited to journey through the Pauline corpus. Both New Testament cycles, the Gospel narratives and the letters, begin every year in the Paschal night, Easter, a festival that from this viewpoint represents the mirror image of the Jewish Simchat Torah, the joy of Torah, which ends the annual cycle of synagogal readings. It's a very interesting situation. The Jewish community celebrates the end of the cycle. The Christian community celebrates the beginning of the cycle of readings. Is this something that happened randomly? I don't think so. The exchanges between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages were, as we know, quite vivid, creative, and so on and so forth. And this seems to be some kind of emulation, whatever, mutual kind of response. More important for my purposes is the fact that the Byzantine lectionary, with its contemporary Orthodox iterations, illustrates the perception of Christianity as a philosophical school, not religion. This perception, in turn, might not have been taken as such by the mainstream Byzantines. It definitely is not cherished by the Orthodox in our day and age. But conservatism imposed on them to remain faithful to the earliest apostolic patterns of the Christian experience. And there is no doubt in my mind that the early Christians viewed themselves as philosophers, utterly different in their outlook from their religious contemporaries, be they Pharisees or pagans. I'm not original here. For example, in the Cambridge History of Early Christian Literature, the great scholar Francis Young points out the fact that Christians emerged in history, in the Roman world, as a group of people committed to doctrine, to text exploration, to reading and writing. And this tremendous scholar says, well, this is typical for a philosophical, not religious community. Of course, we have antecedents in the Second Temple Judaism era with the synagogal culture, which is also text-based and doctrine-based. But the way Christians themselves introduced their own ethos in the world, in the culture of that age, shows that their choice was deliberate. They represented themselves as philosophers. I have written on this that small piece on the teacher and his school, and here's a bit more of it. As philosophers, the early Christians called their Lord and Savior teacher, while they refer to themselves as disciples, students. The book of Acts shows that central to their experience were teaching, learning, reading, and fellowship, not religious rituals. Accordingly, they depicted Jesus as a critic of Pharisaic religion, with Paul following closely in the teacher's footsteps. Above all, they depicted Jesus in classical philosophical postures, for example, teaching from a sitting position, Sermon on the Mountain, in Matthew 5. Surrounded by several categories of disciples arrayed in concentric circles, etc., etc., etc. But closer to my topic, I propose that even their selection of scriptural readings for gatherings, including the adoption of an annual cycle of such lectures, is typical for a philosophical school. In so doing, they emulated the classical schools where the canonical texts of the founders were continuously read, with repetition being considered the mother of all learning. In this light, Christian liturgical lectionaries, selections of scriptural pericopes meant to be read on a yearly basis, fit the bill of the ancient pedagogical strategies and signify the earliest self-understanding of Christians as philosophers. Accordingly, the many manuscript lectionaries, including Evangelistaria, or selections of gospel passages reaching us from the Byzantine era, show not only a developed liturgical life, they show continuity with the philosophical rhythms of the earliest Christian experience. From my viewpoint, this aspect is of utmost importance for contemporary Orthodox studies and immediately for locating the Codex Angus within its liturgical context. So what do we know of Codex Angus? While marginal notes and catalogue entries infrequently mentioned it before and after its acquisition by Samuel Angus from his mentor, Adolf Deismann, in 1936, until very recently, the Codex Angus was largely forgotten. Fortunately, in the past few years, two scholars, Albrecht Gerber and Jean-Marie Olivier, have undertaken to study its provenance and the historical vagaries it experienced, while also providing comments on the manuscript's content. Both their articles focus, however, upon matters of context, such as the biographies of Deismann and Angus, together with their failed promises to write about the Codex and the circumstances of the manuscript's acquisition. The two authors agree little and disagree much when it comes to the possible origin of what we now call the Codex Angus. Gerber, following Angus's notes, believes that it could have been written in Constantinople, but Olivier offers no suggestion in this regard. Also, Gerber tentatively proposes that this is an 11th century manuscript, while Olivier pushes its making towards the 13th century. Now, truth be told, even Gerber acknowledges the fact that, and I quote, exactly when, where, and for what type of monastery the Codex Angus was initially produced remains undetermined. Undetermined, but still he says Constantinople and the 11th century. Again, drawing on Angus's statements, Gerber asserts that from Constantinople, the manuscript reached Bulgaria many centuries ago, where it was kept in monasteries and museums. Convincingly, Olivier differs again, discovering that it was kept in the Greek monastery of Kosynica, ransacked by Bulgarian raiders in 1917. Thus, Codex Angus reached Bulgaria in the 20th century, not earlier. It would be good to have the library record corrected to indicate Kosynica monastery and not the Bulgarian church as the place of origin of our manuscript. Deismann acquired the manuscript from a Bulgarian clergyman in 1929. From 1929 on, Gerber's account becomes the main source for the history of the manuscript, tracing its journey from Bulgaria to Germany to Australia. Incidentally, Kosynica Monastery, or Theotokos I Kosiphinissa, is that correct, Andrew? Cheers. He's Greek, he knows how to pronounce. I Kosiphinissa, 20 fig trees? So, Mother of God of the 20 fig trees. So, Kosynica Monastery was recently in the news with the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., giving back to it a lavishly decorated 11th century gospel manuscript. More important for my purposes are the references of the two authors, very brief in Olivier's case, to the manuscript's appearance and content. Gerber offers a detailed description of its quality and state of preservation at the time of writing, before the 2021 restoration, together with comments about Codex Angus's minimal ornamentation, poor calligraphy, frequent typos, and general low standard workmanship. He also gives a detailed description of the size of the tome, the covers, number of leaves, that is 122, which, as we know, is incorrect. This number reflecting the wrong penciled pagination, not the actual number of leaves. Furthermore, he mentions the, I quote, undetermined New Testament gospel tradition, and the quote, represented by the Codex Angus, a matter to which I shall return. So, an undetermined New Testament gospel tradition. This is something to remember. Some of my findings. While to date I was able to explore 70 pages out of 242, and a total of 71 gospel pericopes, I have also browsed the rest in search for clues about the manuscript's structure and landmarks. I have to apologize, I think, because during my Rare Bites talk I mentioned during the conversation the fact that the manuscript doesn't include at the back readings for the festal season and the saints, and as a matter of fact it does. So my apologies. I begin by agreeing with Gerber's point about Codex Angus's stylistic minimalism. Apart from the frontispiece on the first page, immediately, what you see on the slide there, immediately under which run the two columns of the first gospel passage of the year, the ornamentation of the manuscript is extremely scarce. The most frequent ornamentation refers to initial stylized capitals, T's, and E's. T's for the introductory passage, Tokero e Kino, at that time, yeah, the right side, and E's for the introductory phrase, Ipen o Kyrios, the Lord said, left side. There are a few differences there, perhaps you can see. The copists didn't do the same kind of work. The style of those capitals differ from place to place, which is a pleasant thing. However, pale echoes of the main frontispiece appear here and there, and while they are a welcome sight, they do not match the complexity of the first page's illustration. Their deployment is functional, though, marking the beginning of new sections of the liturgical year. For example, there is one such ornate head on page 57, and under it a rubric reading the first Saturday of the fast, that is Lent, and of Saint Theodore, the great martyr, which makes perfect sense. And you can see that page there. The ornamentation indicates the new season, and modern lectionaries concur by marking it quite visibly. However, the Codex Angus does not indicate the transition to other seasons of the liturgical year. For example, the third part, of which Lent is integral, called Triodion, 3 odes, which begins 4 weeks earlier. Nor does it indicate by an ornate head the beginning of the second season, Octoichos, 8 modes of chanting, a week after Pentecost, also known as the weeks after Pentecost. For the audience to have an idea of how peculiar this is, it would suffice to take a look at a 13th century lectionary, manuscript 2803 in the National Library of Greece, Athens, which is richly decorated and has the transition from a liturgical season to another, as well as from an evangelist to another, clearly marked. Of course, due to copyright issues, I could not put there more than the handle or whatever the name of the manuscript. It can be accessed, it's online, it's fully digitized. This manuscript, the Athenian one, is of particular interest, given the similarity between its calligraphy and the best parts of the Codex Angus. The latter seems to be the poorer of the two cousins, as it were. Codex Angus' stylistic minimalism determined Gerber to assert that, I quote, "This lectionary was clearly not intended for display," end of quote, and that its original purpose, again, I quote, was primarily for personal, that is to say, devotional use as a kind of work copy for cenobitic monks or even consecrated anchorites, end of quote. His example of a known 11th century manuscript written for personal use does not convince me. Considering the marks of heavy use, and you can see these marks on the slide there, obviously in the form of fingerprints or what seems to be spilled wine, I would suggest that Codex Angus, oh yeah, they love their Eucharist. I would suggest that Codex Angus was destined for the use of either a small monastery called a skiti or a rural parish. The stains and the marks of intense use denote a liturgical book that was actually employed for liturgical purposes, that is, church assemblies, while the stylistic minimalism and the poor workmanship of the manuscripts suggest the ownership of a parish or a monastery of lesser means. Tracing similar features in manuscripts whose destination is well attested might confirm or infirm my suggestion, but that will have to remain a task for another time. Regarding the selected gospel pericopes, Olivier notes that, I quote, "The Codex contains readings for the days of the week between Easter and Pentecost, and Saturdays and Sundays of the other weeks," end of quote. In turn, Gerber asserts that it contains only Sunday pericopes. Gerber's assessment is incorrect, but Olivier's is closer to the truth. Specifically, for most of the year, the Codex Angus gives only 2 weekly readings for Saturday and Sunday, not merely one, while the Paschal season, Easter to Pentecost, also known as Pentecostarion, 50 days, as well as the Triodion part, are much richer, but incomplete. Taking the Paschal season as a case study, while Olivier asserts that readings for the entire season are provided, I must point out that several exceptions are obvious. For example, the third Paschal week has only 2 readings for Sunday and Monday, with the Monday reading actually not belonging there, in fact representing a large portion of the first of the 12 gospel passages read on Holy Thursday night before Easter. This is botched work, the scribe seemingly not realizing that this passage does not belong to the Paschal cycle. This insertion is not even announced by the usual stylized capital letter. Incomplete is also the 5th Paschal week, the pericope for Wednesday altogether missing, while the first week after Pentecost inaugurates the pattern that will dominate the second liturgical season of Octoichos, that includes only readings for Saturday and Sunday. What Olivier failed to see is that the Codex has more readings for the Lenten season than the weekend ones. His omissions do not end here. Indeed, from folio 96 verso to folio 118 verso, there are 49 gospel passages for the festivals and the saints' days of remembrance throughout the annual 12 months. This section of the book is clearly marked by a small ornate piece. You can see it there, the center, in the center of the slide, but it's the left picture on the left, yeah? So this section of the book is clearly marked by a small ornate piece with many rubrics accompanying most of the pericopes, indicating other occasions when these passages are also read within the liturgical year. And perhaps you see on the center piece, the photo in the middle of the 3, there are some red markings. Those indicate where the same passage can be read during the year. Pretty advanced for whatever century this was done. The section ends unceremoniously with an even smaller decoration at the bottom of page 118 verso. You can see it's the right side photo, followed by the announcement that what follows are the 11 gospel passages cyclically read for Sunday Matins. Of these passages, 3 have only the beginning indicated, the reader having to navigate the Codex to retrieve the rest elsewhere. So again, this requires a lot of familiarity with the manuscript. While this isn't what Olivier calls something like for my own purpose, work draft or something like that, this shows familiarity with the book itself, which familiarity comes only from the repetitive use of the same book, the same readings year after year. The manuscript ends at the bottom of folio 122, so numbered, with the phrase "Doxa si o Theos doxa si," which means "Glory to you, God, glory to you." So it's done, the manuscript is finished. The reverse of the page has illegible writing and the sketch of a large, richly feathered bird, perhaps a peacock or a phoenix. Before moving on, I must point out that should the library correct the pencil numbering of the folios, all the above page numbers will have to change accordingly. The current number, -1. On this note, I briefly turn to the Paschal season, of particular interest to me, given its significance for the understanding of Christianity as a philosophical school. The following analysis reveals more particularities and peculiarities of our manuscript. So the Paschal season. I begin by offering technical details of this first section of the Codex Angus. It goes for 47 pages, from folio 1 to most of numbered folio 25 recto, in fact 24 recto, amounting to 47 gospel pericopes or passages read from the Paschal night to Monday after Pentecost. Of these, 3 passages are from the Synoptics, as follows. Luke 24, 35, for Bright Week's Tuesday. Bright Week in the Orthodox tradition is the first Paschal week. Then Mark 15:43 to 16:8 for the third Paschal Sunday, and then Matthew 18:10 to 20 for Monday after Pentecost. The same 3 synoptic pericopes are read as such in the Orthodox churches of Byzantine tradition to this day. Back to the Codex Angus. The rest of 44 readings of the season are from John's Gospel, including the mistaken pericope of Holy Thursday planted in the third Paschal week. This amount clearly exceeds the number of 15 Johannine passages found by Gerber. I must also note that the same readings of the Paschal season can be found in contemporary Orthodox lectionaries. More relevant to my purposes is the fact that, except for the cases mentioned in the foregoing, Codex Angus has readings for most of the Paschal season, including weekdays. To grasp the significance of this fact, let's remember that for the next section of the lectionary, the Octoichos season, or the weeks after Pentecost, which is the most extensive of the liturgical year, the manuscript has readings only for weekends. Specifically, there are 36 weeks after Pentecost, compared to 8 weeks for the Paschal season and 7 weeks for Lent. It is true that the Lenten season, together with Holy Week, has more space allocated than the Paschal season, 91 pages in the Codex. But this is not unexpected. Lent and the Holy Week are times for intense spiritual exercises, such as reflection on all the scriptural narratives concerning the Lord's suffering, with several Lenten Sundays having 2 gospel pericopes each, one celebrating Jesus' earthly ministry and one dedicated to saintly heroes of the spiritual path. Against this backdrop, I would suggest that the fact that Codex Angus has readings for most of the Paschal season indicates the copyist's awareness of the importance of this part of the liturgical year. Its importance is also denoted by the fact that this season marks the beginning of the annual Byzantine and contemporary Orthodox lectionary. Also important is that most of these pericopes are from John's Gospel. Well, what is the significance of these facts? To answer this question, let's remember that John's Gospel, or what the widespread perception today has a philosophical narrative, not as interesting as the Synoptic Gospels when it comes to making sense of the historical Jesus, in fact represents the vantage point from which the Byzantine tradition contemplates the Lord's identity and mission. I have already mentioned my conviction that John's Gospel captures the ecclesial perception of Jesus Christ, not the message communicated to outside readers. More specifically, John's Gospel contains insights into Christianity as a philosophical school, together with the school's perception of its teacher and his message to the disciples. The fact that the Codex Angus allocates so much space for the Paschal season tells me that whenever the manuscript was written from the 11th to the 13th century, the Byzantines were still aware of the importance of this philosophical key for decoding the Gospel. And since these Johannine passages are supposed to be read at the outset of each new annual cycle, according to classical pedagogical principles of repetition and of continuous study of foundational texts, the philosophical dimension of the lectionary and of the community it serves come to the fore. The scarcity of readings after Pentecost seems to be an indirect confirmation of my conclusions. Nevertheless, the fact that most of this season corresponds to the summer and the autumn months of the Northern Hemisphere, intense in terms of agricultural activities, would also explain the limited amount of readings prescribed for the second part of the lectionary. However, this possibility can be easily deflected given that the Paschal season itself overlaps with a time of demanding agricultural activity. But does this mean that in allocating more time for reading for the Paschal and the Lenten seasons, or for the beginning and the end of the lectionary, the users of Codex Angus define themselves as philosophers instead of religious people? That is unlikely. Then, is Byzantine conservatism the only reason for the length of these two parts of the lectionary? Given the audacity of simplifying the middle of the lectionary, I would think not. And so the special interest of these users in the Paschal season and in the Lenten one, of course, requires further investigation well beyond the scope of this presentation. Final thoughts. I shall conclude my talk by addressing a few other matters in brief. I begin from where I left my discourse a moment ago. Does the Codex Angus tell us something about the community that used it for liturgical purposes? I believe that it does. The diminished number of pericopes for the second season, or of the weeks after Pentecost, denotes a community that could not suspend the summertime's hard work in order to meet for liturgical celebration on a daily basis. For indeed, the presence of a gospel passage in the Codex Angus must be seen as indicative of holding the liturgy where the respective pericope should be read. Less readings means less liturgies. But was this a parish community instead of a monastic one? Not necessarily. While large Byzantine monasteries held daily liturgies, as still is the case in the Orthodox world, the smaller monastic settlements, called scities, did not and do not. Either way, I would propose that it was a smaller community that initially used the manuscript before it came in the possession of Kostynica Monastery. As one of Greece's oldest and largest monasteries, throughout the Middle Ages, Kostynica could have easily held daily liturgies and therefore used more complete lectionaries with readings for the whole year round. Second, regardless of what kind of community made use of the manuscript, monastic or parochial, it must have been a peculiar one. As Gerber pointed out, the Codex Angus illustrates, I quote again, an undetermined New Testament gospel tradition, end of quote. At the time when this manuscript was written, from the 11th to the 13th century, the Byzantines, obsessed with uniformity, reformed their liturgical books, including the lectionaries, and in the process produced a standard version of the scriptures, the so-called imperial edition. Against this backdrop, that the Codex Angus represents an unknown manuscript tradition, and the little exploration I could undertake seems to confirm this assessment, is extraordinary. This definitely does not seem possible for a manuscript written in Constantinople. And so we should drop the idea that it was produced in the last capital city of the Roman Empire. And while the matter of where it has been produced remains undecided, the fact of drawing on a different textual tradition is intriguing. I would not consider impossible that the original community for which the manuscript was written was not mainstream. In other words, not quite orthodox. After all, where the Codex Angus dates from the 11th or the 13th century, groups such as the Bogomils flourished throughout the Balkans, including in northeastern Greece, where Kostinica monastery is located. In saying this, I do not wish to say that Codex Angus belonged to a Bogomil community. The Bogomils were some kind of Gnostic sect, syncretistic. Personally, I know nothing of the Bogomil Lectionary, if some such existed. What is certain is that in its structure and selection of readings, the Codex Angus corresponds to the 13th century Athenian lectionary mentioned above, and, more importantly, from my viewpoint, to the current structure of Orthodox lectionaries. From this viewpoint, the scarcity of pericopes given for the season of the weeks of after Pentecost is not problematic at all, nor is the matter of a different manuscript tradition. But the significance of the Codex Angus's structural overlap with other Byzantine lectionaries and with the current Orthodox one is immense. Contemporary Orthodox Christians read the scriptures as their Byzantine forebears did. As such, in principle, they share in the mindset of their predecessors. This means that irrespective of how oblivious contemporary Orthodox Christians have become of Christianity as a philosophical school, they still follow its early patterns and rhythms. To me, this is an inspiring thought. In the light of the above, Gerber is right to note the following. Although the Sydney University's Codex Angus is a 1,000-year-old Gospel Lectionary, that is to say, it is a medieval religious book, its manifestly spiritual purpose should in no way diminish its academic value to codicology, textual criticism, and paleography, or even social anthropological aspects, such as this lectionary's underpinning theological and cultural assumptions. I fully concur with his assessment. I would add to the list the field of Orthodox studies. Codex Angus has more stories to tell us, and so my modest contribution today should be seen as an invitation for scholars across the world to turn their attention towards it. I end by once again expressing my heartfelt gratitude to the Selby Old Foundation for the privilege I was given to be the inaugural recipient of the Selby Old Fellowship in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith, as well as to the wonderful team of the University of Sydney Library's Rare Books and Special Collections, with whom I have worked so profitably throughout my year-long tenure. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to share a few reflections in response to the fascinating paper by Associate Professor Doru. In doing so, I have no intention of offering my own analysis of the Codex. I will simply seek to highlight some of Doru's insights, consider potential avenues for further exploration, and offer provocations for further discussion. And to allow time for discussion, I will do so briefly. Doru has done well to gaze at the orthodox mind behind the liturgical ordering of Scripture. After all, the study of liturgy is not just the exploration of sources and reconstructing what happened during worship. It is about seeing the connections within the liturgical world of Byzantium and understanding the meaning behind the cycle of feasts and fasts, the lectionary, and their arrangement. It is also about how liturgy, as a sacred ritual, as the philosophical habitus of the faithful, shaped modes of being, aroused emotions, mobilized repentance, inspired wonder, and forged a liturgical community. As Doru indicated, the ordering of the lectionary was not linear and far from random. It invited believers to experience the history of salvation through a liturgical journey, on the road from Pascha to Pentecost, during the 8-week cycle of the different modes of Byzantine music, and of course the hymnal for this cycle, during the season of fixed feasts that enacted and celebrated significant events in the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin Mary, and of course a return to movable cycles such as the Lenten journey to the day of the resurrection. The thing to remember about liturgy in Byzantium is that liturgy was always local. Even when over the centuries, more and more local practices came within the orbit of Constantinople and underwent what scholars call liturgical Byzantinization, leading to a synthesis and consolidation of the Byzantine rites, there were always minor variations that persisted, liturgical nuances that were apparent at a particular monastery or an urban centre. These were far more stark and significant in early Byzantium, and for those who may not be aware, I will briefly compare Jerusalem and Constantinople, if only because it plays into Doru's interest in the Paschal season. Constantinople and Jerusalem were characterised by a number of liturgical differences. Each had its own Eucharistic liturgy, its own cathedral and monastic centres, its own liturgical calendar and lectionary. However, through a process of Byzantinization, the uniqueness of Jerusalem and its Hagiopolite liturgy gradually dissolved and became more and more like that of the great church of Constantinople. In terms of lectionaries, though, before this happened, there is a tale of two cities, especially during the divine liturgy of Pascha and the week that followed, which was known as Bright Week. In Jerusalem, the Gospel reading for the day of Pascha was Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. So the myrrh-bearing women going to the tomb, finding it empty, but encountering an angel who proclaimed to them the news of the resurrection. In Constantinople, the reading was the prologue of John's Gospel. And during Bright Week, there was a Lectio Continua. However, in Jerusalem, something different happened. The prologue of John's Gospel was not read until the end of Bright Week, on the Sunday that is sometimes called New Sunday, so the Sunday that follows Pascha. Unlike Constantinople, the Gospel pericopes for Bright Week in Jerusalem were taken from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All had resurrectional themes, and curiously, they made their way into the Byzantine rites and the received tradition, because by the 10th century, these Gospel pericopes from Jerusalem for Bright Week became the 11 resurrectional Gospels for Sunday Matins throughout the year. By the 10th century, these Gospel pericopes were also experienced alongside hymns that reflected on their significance. We have 11 resurrectional hymns known as Idiomela, composed by Emperor Leo the Wise, and we also have 11 resurrectional hymns known as Exapostularia, composed by Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus. In my own research, I'm interested in how the performance of hymnography followed the lectionary cycle, amplified the stories of Scripture, broke the silence of certain biblical characters with unexpected speech and dialogue, and ultimately invited the faithful to become part of the story of salvation unfolding before them. In this regard, hymnography becomes a kind of rewritten Bible, but also a performative exegesis of Scripture that suspends time and looks at the entirety of the biblical mosaic of salvation. And so I think one of the future opportunities arising from the study of the Codex is to look at the hymnography of the 11th century and see how it interacts with the Byzantine lectionary. Of course, it would also be helpful to continue investigating where the Codex was used. If we are able with some confidence to locate it within a particular church or monastery or skete, this might allow us to reimagine the performance of these Gospels alongside other liturgical arts, hymnography, iconography, homiletics. Doru notes that the Codex Angus has readings for most of the Paschal season, including weekdays, but this is not the case for the Octoichos, the 8-week cycle which recurs throughout a large part of the liturgical calendar. I found this quite interesting. The emergence of weekday pericopes in the Byzantine lectionary dates back to the 8th or 9th century. Scholars believe this came about thanks to the reforms of St. Theodore the Studite, and more generally, the industrious monks of the Studios monastery of Constantinople in the early 9th century. These reforms, which included the compilation of hymnals, such as the Lenten Triodion, sought to intensify the liturgical life of the capital, especially through daily celebrations of the Divine Liturgy. Of course, there is a question of how far this practice of daily Eucharistic celebration spread. It was most certainly a feature of the liturgical life of the Studios monastery, but it is not a foregone conclusion that it was adopted throughout the capital and beyond. It is also worth noting that while it was rare indeed to find manuscripts of the entire New Testament, let alone the Bible, during this time, manuscripts of the Gospels were increasingly common and widely available in the 9th and 10th centuries. However, literacy in Byzantium was still the domain of a minority. Not everyone could read these manuscripts. Nevertheless, they were far more accomplished in the art of listening than we will ever be. The performance of Scripture, alongside sacred songs, with all their visual rhetoric, provided the faithful with a vast array of stories and images. Listening, as well as seeing, smelling, touching during worship, had the power to inscribe an image upon the mind and memory. Scripture, hymns, homilies, and prayers helped the Byzantines to construct an inner world of images and open the potential for performance to reach out towards the divine. Another avenue for future study that might also shed light on the liturgical context of the Codex is one that I believe Doru already intimates in his paper, that of comparative liturgical studies. And I am, of course, referring to the methodology pioneered by Anton Baumstark, which enables the investigation of liturgical sources across traditions in their original languages and in context, with the purpose of elucidating their structural relationships. While this approach is textual and historical, it does illuminate the rhythm and theology of liturgy. Given the initial findings of where the Codex Angus was probably utilised, perhaps comparison with a contemporary lectionary used in a similar geographical location would be fruitful. Allow me to finish by echoing one of Doru's final reflections. Manuscripts like this codex have more stories to tell us. They show us the vital role that liturgy played in the lives of ordinary people, how they searched for divine meaning, how they navigated doubt, how they forged identities, individual and collective. In the field of Byzantine studies, we are very much in the midst of a liturgical turn, which is why today is a timely contribution to this emerging scholarship. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Doru or Andrew? Yes.
Could I ask for a little bit more about the saints that are commemorated? You said there's a hagiographical section. Could you tell me which saints are recorded and whether that's any indication of where the manuscript might have been used?
Yeah, unfortunately, as I have pointed out initially in my talk, I couldn't explore very thoroughly the last part of the manuscript, so I only went for 70 pages, which means like 37 or so folios.
Right.
Yeah, so I had to look past that point to see if the lectionary still observes the canonical, the typical structure, and as Andrew pointed out, this structure was established a few centuries earlier, and that was pretty much it. I could count, and I did, the number of gospel passages, but I didn't look particularly to see what saints are those. But if your question somehow aims at the topic of ecumenism, if the saints of the West that were included, if that's the topic, well, some of them were. And this is interesting. It shows that the manuscript cannot come from earlier than mid-11th century, when the split occurred and stuff like that, if that was recorded at all, at parish level, for example. But yeah, it's first of all, it's a matter of my not having time to go through the entire material. So half a year is not such a long time when you have to work with the text that is in many ways, well, you don't see any of it there, difficult to read, if not illegible. So
even more so for those without any Greek.
well, thankfully I have some Greek, but as I said in the beginning, it doesn't help much because I'm not trained as a paleographer, so it took me honestly a couple of months before I actually started to touch the manuscript, just to get a gist of how the copyist would do shorthand stuff. For example, in many places, rarely do you see in this codex the name of Jesus, for example, fully written, which is Iisus. 6 letters. The copyist uses IS, so the first and the last one. It's more difficult, of course, when it's the genitive, when you have I and Ypsilon or Ypsilon, and stuff like that. So it took me a while to get a sense of all these things. But many times, there's some outright typos. Yeah. So I didn't get to that part. Please.
So who is Samuel Angus? That sounds like a Jewish and a Scottish name popped together.
Yes. I haven't included any details about him, but perhaps you noticed the 2 articles there by the 2 scholars, recent scholars. He was an erudite, a scholar. In the early days of the 20th century, he studied with that German academic Deismann in Berlin. He was equipped with everything a scholar of the time, and I assume at our time, with the need to be equipped with some notions of codicology, paleography, and all that. Apparently he could read, and he managed to publish, upon his return to Sydney, he managed to publish an interesting analysis of ostraka, so inscriptions on seashells. Yeah, so which he collected also in Germany. Yeah, and so those are ancient, of course, ostraka, especially from Greece and Egypt. And he was able to write on those. In other words, he was able to read that stuff, which is even worse than this, I assume. It's a pity he never got to analyze the manuscript, but I don't think he had a very, deep knowledge of it, because he advertised it at some point in the press of the time as lavishly ornamented, exquisitely stylized whatever manuscript, and it's not the case. I mean, this was not someone that you would keep on a shelf. This was heavily used by a liturgical community. You can see the marks, which makes, I believe, for a compelling case, in order to for us to discover what was that community. Andrew pointed this out. This would be amazing for us to discover at least the region where that happened. And then.
Thanks. Fabulous talk. I was wondering if we've been able to do any work on the marginalia. I mean, it looked as if there was a little bit of faint marginalia through the book, but also at the end. And if perhaps I don't know, if we looked at that under UV or whatever, and if that might help us with the provenance or the community that it came from.
Well, yeah, definitely that would be very helpful. I couldn't do any of it. I don't know about the next project of the library to put each folio under the UV light. What I could see is that some of those inscriptions are quite visible, unlike the last page. Some of them are quite visible. I could decipher a few of them. For example, there's quite a nice, neat writing announcing the Festival of Ascension. So from the same Paschal season. It's clearly written. There's also an indication, look, for Matins, you have to read this gospel passage, and it gives the first few words of the passage, not the entire passage. So very, very useful, but these are more like rubrics. What you're interested in is the other stuff, the good stuff, where, for instance, someone said, it's me who spilled the wine. But I did it. So there's the young lady there. And
We have put so much significance on this book now, but you mentioned that it was probably used in a local, like a small church.
Yep.
It was used in such a small local place. Why so much significance in this book? In the larger scheme of Orthodox religion, if it was used just in a small place.
That's a good question, but see, it's not just cathedrals that matter for the understanding of history, for the understanding of our evolution in time, historical experiences, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's very revealing to work on things from the margins. They are more telling about the real life. Like, for instance, I was so moved when I realized what actually happened in this codex. And as Andrew pointed out, they have centuries earlier established the rhythm of readings, including prescribing readings for every day of the week for the whole year. And then you have it after like 2-3 centuries, perhaps more. You have this codex that only gives you an abbreviated version of the largest part of the year, which corresponds to the months when people are more engaged in agricultural activities. The summertime and autumn and all that. Those are days and seasons when people, rural communities, are at work, They cannot afford meeting every day for the liturgy. So this was for me a revelation. Wow. So this isn't something that was used for, I don't know what, big community in an urban setting or some cathedral. Of course, it doesn't look like one of those beautifully embellished things, whatever. But it's the little people that matter from this viewpoint, Real life. These people were very realistic, and whoever put the money towards writing this manuscript were aware of the fact that those people, regular people, had their lives, and they had to maintain a certain rhythm of life that did not preclude them from attending the next liturgy, having something to eat before that. Thank you. Please.
Were the annotations written over time? Were they kind of later, century later, as was used?
Well, I assume that this is something that you can trace only with some carbon dating or some other chemical stuff, to see if the ink is the same. What I can tell you from my cursory exploration of the manuscript is the fact that it's not the same hand that did the manuscript, and it's not the same hand that did all those annotations, like it's me that spilled the wine, or other things like that. So it must be, it must have been used for several generations, and because a parish church has today a parish priest, then another parish priest, then another parish priest, and so on and so forth, and they all drink wine or whatever they drink, and
write the notes there. My apology, it's me.
Thank you very much.
If there are no further questions, please join me once again in thanking Doru and Andrew. And on your way out, I neglected to mention we have the Codex Angus here, so if you haven't seen it in person and you'd like to take a look, please do so. I'd ask you not to touch, just ask if you want to see a particular feature or a particular page and we can help you with that. So please come up and take a look.
Thanks, Andrew.